Chapter 5. The meeting was at the academy. When Conn and his father arrived, they found the central hall under the topside landing stage crowded. Kurt Fozzie and Professor Kelton had constituted themselves a reception committee. Franz Veltrin was in evidence with his audiovisual recorder, and Colonel Zaref was leaning on his silver-headed sword cane. Tom Brangwyn, in an unaccustomed best suit, Wade Lucas among a group of merchants arguing heatedly, Lorenzo Menardis, the distiller, and Lester Dawes, the banker, and Morgan Gatworth, the lawyer, talking to Judge Ledoux, about 4 times as many as had been in Fozzie's office the afternoon before. Finally, everybody was shepherded into a faculty conference room. There was a long table and a shorter one tea-wise at one end. Fozzie and Kelton conducted them to this. Both of them were trying to preside. Kelton because it was his academy, and Fozzie ex officio as mayor and professional leading citizen, and because he had come to regard Merlin as his own private project. After everybody else was seated, the 2 rival chairmen presumptive remained on their feet. Fozzie was saying, "Let's come to order. We must conduct this meeting regularly." And Kelton was saying, "Gentlemen, please, let me have your attention." If either of them took the chair, the other would resent it. Conn got to his feet again. "Somebody will have to preside," he said loudly enough to cut through the babble at the long table. "Would you take the chair, Judge Ledoux?" That stopped it. Neither of them wanted to contest the honor with the president judge of the Gordon Valley Court. "Excellent suggestion, Conn. Judge, will you preside?" Professor Kelton, who had seen himself losing out to Fozzie, asked. Fozzie threw one quick look around, estimated the situation, and got with it. "Of course, Judge. You're the logical chairman. Here, will you sit here?" Judge Ledoux took the chair, looked around for something to use as a gavel, and rapped sharply with a paperweight. "Young Mr. Conn Maxwell, who has just returned from Terra, needs no introduction to any of you," he began. Then, having established that, he took the next 10 minutes to introduce Conn. When people began fidgeting, he wound up with, "Now, only about a dozen of us were at the informal meeting in Mr. Fozzie's office yesterday, Conn. Would you please repeat what you told us? Elaborate as you see fit." Conn rose. He talked briefly about his studies on Terra to qualify himself as an expert. Then he began describing the wealth of abandoned and still undiscovered Federation war material, and the many installations of which he had learned, careful to avoid giving clues to exact locations. The spaceport, the underground duplicate force command headquarters, the vast underground arsenals and shops and supply depots. Everybody was awed, even his father. He hadn't had time to tell him more than a fraction of it. Finally, somebody from the long table interrupted. "Well, Conn, how about Merlin? That's what we're interested in." Wade Lucas snorted indignantly. "He's telling you about real things, things worth millions of sols, and you want to talk to him about that fantasy?" There was an angry outcry. Nobody actually shouted, "To the stake with the blasphemer!" but that was the general idea. Judge Ledoux was rapping loudly for order. "I don't know the exact location of Merlin." Conn strove to make himself heard. "The whole subject's classified top secret. But I am certain that Merlin exists, if not on Poictesme, then somewhere in the Alpha system, and I am equally certain that we can find it." Cheers. He waited for the hubbub to subside. Lucas was trying to yell above it. "You admit you couldn't learn anything about this so-called Merlin, but you're still certain it exists." "Why are you certain it doesn't?" "Why, the whole thing's absurdly fantastic." "Maybe it is, to a layman like you. I studied computers, and it isn't to me." "Well, take all these elaborate preparations against space attack you were telling us about. I think Colonel Zaref here, who served in the Alliance Army, will bear me out that such an attack was plainly impossible." Zaref started to agree, then realized that he was aiding and comforting the enemy. "Intelligence lag," he said. "What do you expect with General Headquarters 30 parsecs from the fighting?" "Yes, a computer can only process the data that's been taped into it," Conn said. That was a point he wanted to ram home as forcibly and as often as possible. I suppose Merlin classified an alliance attack on Poictesme as a low-order probability. But war is the province of chance. Clausewitz said that 1,000 years ago. Fox Travis wasn't the sort of commander to let himself get caught, even by a very low-order probability. Well, how do you explain the absence, after 40 years, of any mention in any history of the war of Merlin? How do you get around that? I don't have to. How do you get around it? Huh? Lucas was startled. Yes, stories about Merlin were all over Poictesme, all through the Third Force, even to the enemy. Say the stories were unfounded. Say Merlin never existed. Yet the belief in Merlin was an important historical fact, and no history of the war gives it so much as a footnote. He paused for effect, then continued. That can mean only one thing: systematic suppression, backed by the whole force of the Terran Federation, a gigantic conspiracy of silence. Brother, if they swallow that I haven't made, they'll swallow anything. They did, all but Lucas. He banged his fist on the table. Now I've heard everything, he shouted in disgust. Not quite everything, Doctor, Morgan Gatwer said. You will hear, one of these days, that we have found Merlin. Yes, that'll be the day. Lucas sprang to his feet, his chair toppling behind him. He shoved it aside with his foot. I'm not going to argue with you. Conn Maxwell gave you a 1,000-year-old quotation. I'll give you another from Thomas Paine. To argue with those who have renounced the use and authority of reason is as futile as to administer medicine to the dead. I'll add this. Conn Maxwell knows better than this balderdash he's been spouting to you. I don't know what his racket is, and I'm not staying to find out. You will, though, to your regret. He turned and strode from the room. There was a moment's silence after the door slammed behind him. Too bad, Conn thought. He would have made a good friend. Now who's going to make a very nasty enemy? Well, let's get to business, his father said. We don't have to argue about the existence of Merlin. We know that. Let's discuss the question of finding it. I still think it's somewhere off-planet, Lorenzo Bernardo said. The moons of Pantagruel. Evidently he'd read something or seen an old film about the moons of Pantagruel. No, that's too far. They'd keep it where they could use it. The old GHQ, Lester Dawes suggested. Suppose it's down under that, like the place Rodney found at the 10th Army. I hope not, Gathworth said. The planetary government took that over. Well, wherever it is, finding it is going to be expensive, Rodney Maxwell said. Now, to finance the search, I propose we use this information my son brought back from Terra. Dr. Lucas was right about one thing. That's worth millions of sols. Well, I propose also that we set up a company and get it chartered, a prospecting company to operate under the Abandoned Property Act of 867. My son and I will contribute this information as our share in the capitalization of the company. The work of opening these Federation installations can go on concurrently with the search for Merlin, and the profits can finance it. Silence for a moment. Then a bedlam of cheering. Well, let's get organized, Gatworth said. What will we call this company? A number of voices shouted suggestions. Rodney Maxwell managed to get recognition in partial silence. It is of the first importance, he said, that we keep our real objective, Merlin, as close a secret as possible. The planetary government would like to get a hold of it, and I leave you to ask yourselves how far Jake Vykovin and his cronies are to be trusted with anything like that. And I have no doubt the Federation might try to take it away from us. Couldn't do it, Rodney, Judge Ledoux objected. Everything the Federation abandoned in the Tri-System is public domain now. We have a Federation Supreme Court ruling. What's legality to the Federation? Clemzeres demanded. They fought a criminally illegal war of aggression against my people. Down the table, somebody started singing Rally Round the Banner black and green. Well, I think it's a good idea to keep quiet about it myself, Kurt Fawsey said. All right, Rodney Maxwell said, then we don't want this company to sound anything like but another salvage company. I suggest we call it Litchfield Exploration and Salvage. Good name, Rodney, Dawes approved. That a motion? I second it. Unanimously carried. They had a name now, anyhow. Everybody began suggesting other topics for consideration: capitalization, application for charter, election of officers, stock issues. Conn paid less and less attention. Industrial finance and organization wasn't his subject either. His father was plunging happily into it as though he had been promoting companies all his life. Conn sat and doodled with his six-color pen, mostly spherical hyperspace ships. We can't get all this cleared up now, Lester Dawes was protesting. Your Honor, Mr. Chairman, I suggest that committees be appointed. More hassling. Everybody wanted to be on all the committees. Finally, they appointed enough committees to include everybody. Well, that seems to be cleared up, Judge Ledoux said. I suggest a meeting day after tomorrow evening. The committee should have everything set up, and we should be able to organize ourselves and elect permanent officers. Is there anything else to discuss, or do I hear motion to adjourn? Somebody thought they ought to have some idea of what the first operation would be. You heard me mention a spaceport, Conn said. I can tell you now that it's over on Barathrum, inside the crater of an extinct volcano. I think we ought to have a look at that, first of all. I know you seemed to think yesterday that Merlin is off-planet, Fawsey said. I'm inclined to disagree, Conn. I think it's right here on Poictesme. We ought to nail down that spaceport first, Conn argued. Conn, you mentioned an underground duplicate of Travis General Headquarters, Zaref said. They thought we'd possibly send a fleet here to blitz Poictesme. They wouldn't have built that. And this underground headquarters would be the safest place on the planet. They'd make sure of that. Staff brass don't like to get caught out in the rain, not when it's raining hell burners and planet busters. Merlin would be too big to take there along with them, so they put it there in the first place. That made sense. If he'd been Fox Travis, and if there had been a Merlin, that was exactly where he'd have put it himself. But there was no Merlin, and he wanted a ship. He argued mulishly for a little, then saw that it was hopeless and gave in. I want to find Merlin as much as any of you, he said. More Merlin was the only thing I was trained for. We'll look there first. Somebody asked where, approximately, this underground force command headquarters was. Why, it's in the Badlands, over between the Blaubergs and the East Coast. Great goo! We'll need an army to go in there, Tom Bringwin said. That's where all these outlaws have been coming from, Blackie Paralis and all. Then we'll get an army together, Clem Zaref said happily. Might make a little of that reward money that's been offered. We'll need more than that. We'll need excavation equipment and labor. Lots of labor, Conn said. It's a couple of 100 feet below the surface. From the plans, I'd say they just dug a big pit, built the headquarters in it, and filled it in. There are 2 entrances, a vertical shaft and a horizontal tunnel. When they pulled out, they probably filled the shaft and vitrified the rock at the outer end, his father added. That was what they did at 10th Army. Another idea hit him. Mr. Mayor, do you think you could set up some kind of a public works program here in Litchfield? We can't start this till after the wine pressing's over, and we'll need a lot of labor, as I pointed out. Now, it's important that we keep all our projects a secret until we can get our claims filed. If we start this municipal fix-up and clean-up program, we can give work to a lot of these drifters who haven't been able to get jobs on the plantations, get them organized into gangs, and keep them together till we're ready for the Force Command job. Lorenzo Menardis supported the idea. And while they were boondoggling around in Litchfield, we could pick out the best workers, get rid of the incompetents, and train a few supervisors. That's going to be one of our worst headaches, getting capable supervisors. You telling me, Rodney Maxwell added. That was what I was wondering about, where we'd get gang bosses. And another thing, this municipal house cleaning would mask our real preparations. Well, we need something like that, Fozzie said. We've needed it for a long time. I guess it took Conn coming home from Terra to see how badly we let the town get run down. Franz, suppose you and Tom Brangwyn and Lorenzo form a committee on that. Look around, see what needs fixing up worst, and set up a project. Who's city engineer now? Abe O'Leary. He died 6 years ago, Dawes said. You never appointed his successor. Well, I guess I never got around to that, the mayor of Litchfield admitted. When the meeting finally adjourned, they went up and got in the car. His father lifted it straight up to 30,000 feet and started circling. An air car was one place where they could talk freely. Conn, I was kind of worried down there. You were being a little too positive. You know you're only 23. As long as you agree with those people, you're a brilliant man. You start getting ideas of your own, and you're just a half-baked kid. You let the older and wiser heads run things. You can't begin to hope to foul things up the way they can. Look at all the experience they've had. But we've got to have a ship. Everything depends on that. I know it does. We'll get a ship. Let Kurt Fozzie and Clem Zaref and the rest of them have the duplicate force command. Keep them happy. As soon as we have that opened, you can take a gang and run over to Barathrum and grab your spaceport. Wait till they find out that Merlin isn't at force command duplicate. Then you can convince them it's really on Koshai. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The car Rodney Maxwell got out of the hangar the next morning wasn't the one he and Conn had gone to the meeting in. It was the one he had flown in from 10th Army HQ at noon of the previous day. An Army reconnaissance job, slim and needle-like, completely enclosed, looking more like a missile than a vehicle, and armored in dazzling, iridescent collapsium. There was something to living on Poictesme, at that. Only a millionaire on Terra could have owned a car like that. Nice, Conn said. Where did you dig it? Where we're going, 10th Army? I bet she'll do Mach 3. Better than that. I've never had her above 2.5, but the airspeed gauge is marked up to 4, and she has everything. All kinds of detection instruments, cameras, audiovisual pickups, armament, and the armor. You can take her through any kind of radiation. The armor was only a couple of microns thick, but it would stop anything. It was collapsed matter. The electron shells of the atoms collapsed upon the nuclei, the atoms in actual contact. That plating made 8-inch sheet steel as heavy as 12-inch armor plate, and in texture and shielding properties, lead was like a sponge by comparison. They climbed in, and Rodney Maxwell snapped on the screens that served as windows. Conn leaned back and looked at the underside view in a screen on the roof of the car as his father started the lift engine. Still think it's worth the price, son? His father asked. The price had begun to rise. Even so, he was afraid that what they had paid so far was only the down payment. Dinner last evening, Flora, who had evidently been talking to Wade Lucas, shouting accusations at them, his mother fleeing from the table in tears. As the car rose, he reached out and turned on and adjusted the telescreen for the underview. Keep your eye on that, Father, he said. That's what we're paying to get rid of. A distillery, bigger than the Menardis plant, long closed and now half roofless and crumbling. Rows of warehouses, empty after the war until taken over by homeless vagrants. Jerry-built shanties with rattletrap air cars grounded around them. Tramp town, a festering sore on the south side of Litchfield. If we put this over, he continued, all those tramps will have steady work and good homes. We can have a park there, with fountains that'll work. Maybe even Flora and Mother will think we've done something worth doing. It'll be kind of hard to take in the meantime, though, but if you can take it, I can. Rodney Maxwell turned off the underside teleview screen and put on the forward one. See that little pink spot over there? Sunrise on the east side of Snagtooth. 10th Army is just behind it. Now let's see if this airspeed gauge is telling the truth or just bragging. Sudden acceleration pushed them back in their seats. The calibrations on the gauge rose swiftly. The pink-lighted peak grew swiftly on the teleview screen. The gauge hadn't been bragging. It had been understating. The car had more speed than the instrument could register. 2.5 minutes from Litchfield, they were decelerating and swinging slowly around Snagtooth, looking down upon a tilted plateau that ended on the western side in a sheer drop of almost 1,000 feet. There were ruinous buildings on it, barracks and storehouses and offices, an airship dock and an air traffic control tower from which all the glass had long ago vanished. A great steel telecast tower that had fallen, crushing a couple of buildings. Young trees had already grown among the wreckage. Look over there. On the slope below it, there is one entrance to the shelters. There was a clearing among the evergreens 1/2 mile from the buildings, and raw earth and a couple of big scows grounded near. They bulldozed rock and earth over the end of the tunnel. Then there's another one down on that bench, a couple of 100 feet below the edge of the plateau. They blasted rock down over that. The main entrance is a vertical shaft under that pre-stressed concrete dome. That was chapel, auditorium, or something. They just covered it with sheet metal and poured a foot of concrete on top. They floated down above the broken roofs and crumbling walls and grounded in the area between the main administration building and the offices, back of the ship docks. Once he supposed it had been a lawn. Then it had been a jungle. Now it was a scuffed, littered, bare-trodden workyard. Men were straggling out of the administration building, lighting pipes and cigarettes. They all wore new but work-soiled infantry battle dress. All of them waved and shouted greetings. One, about Conn's own age, approached. As he got out, Conn saw the resemblance to Lester Dawes, the banker, before he recognized Anne's Dawes, who was one of his closest friends 6 years ago. They shook each other's hands and pounded each other on the back. "Hey, you're looking great, Conn." They all told him that. He'd begin to believe it pretty soon. "Sorry I couldn't make the party, but somebody had to sit on the lid here, and Jerry Rivas and I cut cards for it, and Jerry won." "You didn't tell me Ons was with you." He approached his father. Rodney Maxwell said he'd been saving that for a surprise. When Conn asked Ons what was the matter with the bank, he said, "For the birds. I'd as soon count sheets of toilet paper as this stuff we're using for money." "Sooner, really. Toilet paper can be used for something, and this paper money's too stiff. Maybe some of the stuff we're digging here isn't worth much, but at least it's real." That was something else the Maxwell plan would have to take care of. Gresham's law was running hog wild on Poictesme. A planetary government, Sol was worth about 10 centisols, Federation, and aside from deposit boxes, and woolen socks under the beds, and tin cans buried in the corner of the cellar, Federation currency was non-existent. "Had breakfast yet?" Rodney Maxwell asked. "Oh, hours ago. I was out and shot another spike nose. It's hanging up back of the kitchen, waiting for the cook to skin it and cut it up." He grinned at Conn. "You don't get this kind of hunting in a bank either." "Jerry's still inside?" "I want to see him. Suppose you take Conn around and show him the sights, and don't worry about him bumping you out of a job. Worry you'll have to do 6 or 8 extra jobs on top of your own from now on." Chapter 7. 52 years before, they had come to the mesa in the Badlands and dug a pit on top of it, 1,000 feet in diameter and more than 500 deep, and in it they built a duplicate of the headquarters for 3rd Fleet Army Force Command. They built a shaft 100 feet in diameter like a chimney at one side, and they ran a tunnel out through solid rock to the head of a canyon 1/2 mile away. Then they buried the whole thing. 12 years later, when the war was over, they sealed both entrances and went away and left it. For a month each winter, cold rains from the east lashed the desert. For the rest of the year, it was swept by wind-blown sand. Wiregrass sprouted and thorn bush grew. Nature, the master camoufleur, completed the work of hiding the forgotten headquarters. Little things, not unlike rabbits, scampered over it, and bigger things, vaguely fox-like, hunted them. Hunted men came, too, their cars skimming low. None of them had the least idea what was underneath. The mesa top came suddenly to life, just as the sun edged up out of the east. Conn and his father and Ansdaz came in first, in the recon car, with which they had scouted and photographed the site a few days before. They circled at 1,000 feet, fired a smoke bomb, and then let down near where Conn's map showed the head of the vertical shaft. The rest followed. First, a couple of combat cars that circled slowly, scanning the ground, and then the Lester Dawes with their big guns and her load of equipment, and behind a queue of boats and scows and heavy engineering equipment on contragravity and troop carriers, full of workmen and guards, flanked by air cavalry, which circled above while everything else landed, then scattered out over a 50-mile radius. Occasionally there was a hammering of machine guns, either because somebody saw something on the ground that might need shooting at, or simply because it was a beautiful morning to make a noise. The ship settled quickly and daintily, while Conn and Ons and Rodney Maxwell sat in the car and watched. Immediately she began opening like a beetle bursting from its shell, large sections of armor swinging outward. Except for the bridge and the gun turrets, almost the whole ship could be opened. She had been designed to land in the middle of a battle and deliver ammunition when seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Jeeps and lifters and manipulators and things floated out of her. Scows began landing and unloading prefab hut elements. A water tank landed, and the cook shed began going up beside it. A lorry came in with scanning and probing equipment, and a couple of men jumped off and huddled over a photoprint copy of one of Conn's maps. Conn lifted the car again and coasted it half a mile to where the cleft of the mesa started. There were half a dozen claw-arm manipulators already there, and 2 giant power shovels. Jerry Rivas and one of the engineers Kurt Fozzie had hired had gotten out of a jeep and were looking at another photoprint of the map. Rivas pointed to the head of the canyon where a mass of rock had slid down. "That's it. You can still see where they put off the shots." The canyon was long enough and wide enough for the Lester Dawes to land in it. She could be loaded directly from the tunnel. The manipulators began moving in, wrestling with the larger chunks of rock and dragging or carrying them away. Power shovels began grunting and clanking and rumbling. Dust rose in a thick column. Toward mid-morning, the troop carriers which served as school buses in Litchfield arrived, loaded with more workmen. A lorry lettered Store Send Herald Guardian came in, hovered over the canyon, and began transmitting audio-visuals. More newsfolk put in an appearance. The earth and rock at the top of the tunnel entrance fell away, revealing the vitrified stone lintel. Everybody cheered and dug harder. More aircars arrived, getting in each other's and everybody else's way. Raymond Fitch, Lester Dawes, Lorenzo Menardis, and Morgan Gatworth, Dolph Kelton playing hooky from school, Kurt Fozzie. He landed in the canyon and watched every shovelful of rock lifted, as though trying to help with mental force. Tom Brangwyn, with a score of the Home Guard to reinforce the company police. Clem Zaref called in his air cavalry to help control the sightseers. Nobody was making trouble. They were just getting in the way. At 11, Rodney Maxwell went aboard the Lester Dawes to use the radio and telescreen equipment. By then, 2 time zones west and Store Send, the claims office was opening. He filed preliminary claim to an underground installation with at least 2 entrances in uninhabited country and claimed a 10-mile radius around it. By that time, the gang working on top had uncovered a vitrified slab over the 100-foot circle of the vertical shaft and were cracking it with explosives. According to the scanners, it was full of loose rubble for 100 feet down. Below that, the microarrays hit something impenetrable. Toward afternoon, the tunnel in the canyon was cleared. It had been vitrified solid. The scanners reported that it was plugged for 10 feet. A contragravity tank let down in front of it with a solenoid jackhammer mounted where the gun should have been, and began pounding, running a hole in for a blast shot. There were more explosions topside. When Conn took up a jeep to observe progress there, he found the vitrified rock blown completely off the vertical shaft, exposing the rubble that had been dumped into it. The gang on the mesa top had discovered something else, a grid of oro-copper bus bars buried 4 feet underground. 10 to 1, radio and telescreen signals would be transmitted to that from below, and then probably picked up and rebroadcast from a relay station on one or another of the high buttes in the neighborhood. Time enough to look for that later. He returned to the canyon, where the lateral tunnel was now almost completely open. When it was clear, they sent a snooper in first. It was a robot looking slightly like a short-tailed tadpole, 6 feet long by 3 feet at the thickest. It transmitted a view of the tunnel as it went slowly in. The air, it found, was breathable, and there were no harmful radiations or other dangers. According to the plans, there should be a big room at the other end, slightly curved, 100 feet wide by 100 on either side of the tunnel entrance. The robot entered this, and in its headlight they could see reconnaissance cars and contragravity tanks with 90mm guns. It swerved slightly to the left, and then the screen stopped receiving. The telemetered instruments went dead, and the robot's signals stopped. "Tom," Rodney Maxwell said, "you keep the crowd back. Clem, stay with the screens. I'll transmit to you. I'm going in to see what's wrong." He started to give Conn an argument when he wanted to accompany him. "No," Conn said, "I'm going along. What do you think I went to Terra to study robotics for?" His father snapped on the screen and picked up the jeep that was standing nearby. "You getting it, Clem?" he asked. "Okay, Conn, let's go." Half a mile ahead, at the other end of the tunnel, they could see a flicker of light that grew brighter as they advanced. The snooper still had its light on and was moving about. Once they caught a momentary signal from it. As Rodney Maxwell piloted the jeep, Conn kept talking to Clem Zaref outside. Then they were at the end of the tunnel and entering the room ahead. It was full of vehicles like the one on the bottom level at 10th Army HQ. As soon as they were inside, Clem Zaref's voice in the radio stopped, as though the set had been shot out. "Clem, what's wrong? We aren't getting you," his father was saying. The snooper was drifting aimlessly about, avoiding the parked vehicles. Conn used the manual control to set it down and deactivate it, then got out and went to examine it. "Take the jeep over to the tunnel entrance," he told his father. "Move out into the tunnel a few feet. Relay from me to Clem." The jeep moved over. A moment later his father cried, "He's getting me." "I'm getting him. What's the matter with the radio in here? The snooper's all right, isn't it?" It was. Conn reactivated it and put it up above the tops of the vehicles. "Sure, we just can't transmit out." "But it's only half a mile of rock. That set's good for more than that. It'll transmit clear through Snagtooth." "It won't transmit through Collapsium." His father swore disgustedly, repeating it to Zaref outside. Conn could hear the old soldier in the radio make a similar remark. They should have all expected that in the first place. If the Third Force High Command was expected to set out a nuclear bombardment in this place, they'd armor it against anything. "Bring the gang in. It's safe as far as we've gotten," his father said. "We'll just have to string wires out." Conn used his flashlight and found the power unit for the room lights. All the overhead lights were wired to one unit, if wired were the word for gold leaf circuits cemented to the walls and covered with insulating paint. For the heavy stuff, like the ventilator fans, they'd have to find the central power plant. He looked around the big room, poking into some of the closets that lined it. Radiation-proof clothing, tools, arms and ammunition, first aid kits, emergency rations. All the vehicles were plated in shimmering collapsium. The crowd started coming in. The work gang selected for the first exploration work, most of them old hands of Rodney Maxwell's. The engineers they had recruited, Mohammed Matsui. He had a gang of his own, the same one he had been using in tearing down the converter at 10th Army. The stockholders and officials, the press, and everybody else Tom Brangwen's police hadn't been able to keep out. The power plant was at the extreme bottom. Matsui began looking it over at once. Above it they found the service facilities, air and water plant, pumps for the artesian well, sewage disposal, then repair ships and a laboratory and laundries and kitchens above that. "Where do you suppose it is?" Kurt Fawsey was asking. "Up at the very top, I suppose. Let's go up and work down. I can't wait till we've found it. Like a kid on Christmas Eve, Conn thought. And there was no Santa Claus, and Christmas had been abolished. The place was built in concentric circles, level above level, combat equipment nearest the tunnel exit and nearest the vertical shaft, and ambulances and decontamination units and equipment for relief and rebuilding next. Storerooms, mile on circular mile of them. Not the hasty pack rat cramming he'd seen at 10th Army. Everything had been brought in order, carefully piled or racked, and then left. More stores for the next 3 levels up, then living quarters, enlisted men's and women's quarters, no signs of occupancy, enlisted kitchens and mess halls, untouched. Most of the officers' quarters were similarly unused, but here and there some had been occupied. A sloppily made bed, a used cake of soap in the bathroom, an empty bottle in a closet. Officers' commissary stores had been used from and replaced. The officers' mess hall and kitchen had been in constant use, and the officers' club had a comfortably scuffed and lived-in look. There had been a few people there all the time of the war. Men and women, all officers or civilians, Clemzera said. Didn't even have enlisted men to cook for them, and we haven't found a scrap of paper with writing on it or an inch of recorded sound tape or audiovisual film. Remember those big wire baskets down at the mass energy converters? Before they left, they disintegrated every scrap of writing or recording. This is where Merlin is. They were the people who worked with it. And above, offices, general staff, war planning, with an incredibly complex star map of the theater of war, Judge Advocate General, Inspector General, Service of Supply. They were full of computers, each one firing the hopes of people like Fawsey and Dolph Kelton and Judge Ledoux, but they were only special-purpose machines, the sort to be found in any big business office. The Stores and Stock Exchange probably had much bigger ones. Then they found big ones, rank on rank of cabinets, long consoles studded with lights and buttons, programming machines. "It's Merlin!" Fawsey almost screamed. "We've found it!" One of the reporters who had followed them in snatched his radio handphone from his belt and jabbered. Then, realizing that the collapsium shielding kept him from getting out with it, he replaced it and bolted away. "Hold it!" Conn yelled at the others, who were also becoming hysterical. "Wait till I take a look at this thing." They managed to calm themselves. After all, he should know what it was. Wasn't that why he'd gone to school on Terra? They'd followed him from machine to machine, first hopefully, and then fearfully. Finally he turned, shaking his head and feeling like a doctor in a film show, telling the family that there's no hope for Grandpa. This is not Merlin. This is the personnel file machine. It's taped for the records and data of every man and woman of the Third Force for the whole war. It's like the student record machine at the university. Might have known it. This section in here is marked G1 all over everything. That's personnel. Wouldn't have Merlin in here, Clemzera was saying. Well, we'll just keep on hunting for it till we do find it, Kurt Fawsey said. It's here somewhere. It has to be. The next level up was much smaller. Here were the offices of the top echelons of the Force command staff. They, unlike the ones below, had been used. From them, too, every scrap of writing or film or record tape had vanished. Finally, they entered the private office of Force General Fox Travis. It had not only been used, it was in disorder. Ashtrays full, many of the 40-year-old cigarette ends, lipstick tinted. Chairs shoved around at random, 3 bottles on the desk with Terran bourbon labels, 2 empty and 1 with about an inch of whiskey left in it. But no glasses. That bothered Conn. Somehow he couldn't quite picture the commander and staff of the 3rd Fleet Army Force passing bottles around and drinking from the neck. Then he noticed that the wall across the room was strangely scarred and scratched. Dropping his eye to the floor under it, he caught the twinkle of broken glass. They had gathered here and talked for a long time. Then they had risen for a final toast, and when it was drunk, they had hurled their glasses against the wall and smashed them. Then they had gone out, leaving the broken glass and the empty bottles, knowing that they would never return. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Before they returned to the lower level into which the lateral tunnel entered, Matsui and his gang had the power plant going. The ventilator fans were humming softly, and whenever they pressed a starting button, the escalators began to move. They got the pumps going, and the oxygen generators, and the sewage disposal system. Until the communication center could be checked and the relay station found, they ran a cable out to the Lester Dawes, landed in the canyon, and used her screen and radio equipment. Before the claims office and store send closed, Rodney Maxwell had transmitted in recorded views of the interior and enough of a description for a final claim. They also received teleprint copies of the store send papers. The first story, in an extra edition of the Herald Guardian, was headlined, "Merlin Found." That would have been the reporter who bolted off prematurely when they first saw the personnel record machines. Conn wondered if he still had a job. A later edition corrected this, but was full of extravagant accounts of what had been discovered. Merlin or no Merlin, Force Command Duplicate was the biggest abandoned property discovery since the Third Force left the Tri-System. The camp they had set up on top of the mesa was used that night only by Clem Zareff's guards. Everybody else was inside, eating cold rations when hungry, and when they could keep awake no longer, bedding down on piles of blankets or going up to the barracks rooms above. The next day they found the relay station which rebroadcast signals from the buried aerial, or would one say subterrial, on top of the mesa. As Conn had expected, it was on top of a high butte 3.5 miles to the south. It had been so skillfully camouflaged that none of the outlaw bands who roamed the Badlands had found it. After that, Force Command Duplicate was in communication with the rest of Poictesme. They moved into the staff headquarters at the top. Fox Travis' office, tidied up, became the headquarters of the company officials and chief supervisors. The workmen quartered themselves in the enlisted barracks, helping themselves liberally to anything they found. The crowds of sightseers kept swarming in, giving Tom Brangman's police plenty to do. Tom himself turned the marshal's office in Litchfield over to his chief deputy. Clem Zareff insisted on more men for his guard force. A dozen gunboats, 80-foot craft mounting one 90mm gun, several small autocannon, and one missile launcher, had been found. He took them over immediately, naming them for capital ships of the old System States Navy. It took some argument to dissuade him from repainting all of them black and green. He kept them all in the air, with a swarm of smaller airboats and combat cars, circling the underground headquarters at a radius of 100 miles. These patrols reported a general exodus from the region. At least a dozen outlaw bands, all with fast contragravity, had been camped inside the zone. Some fled at once. The rest needed only a few warning shots to send them away. Other bands, looking like legitimate prospecting parties, began to filter into the Badlands. Zareff came to Rodney Maxwell instead of Kurt Fawsey, the titular head of the company, which was significant, to find out what policy regarding them would be. "Well, we have no right to keep them out as long as they stay outside our 10-mile radius," Conn's father said. "As we're the only thing that even looks like law around here, I'd say we have an obligation to give them protection. Have your boats investigate them. If they're legitimate, tell them they can call on us for help if they need it." Conn protested privately. "There's a lot of stuff around here in small caches," he said. "Equipment for guerrilla companies that invent evasion. When work slacks off here, we could pick that stuff up." "Conn, there's an old stock market maxim. A bear can make money sometimes, and a bull can make money sometimes. But in the long run, a hog always loses. Let the other people find some of this. It'll all help the plan. Fact is, I've been thinking of leaking some information if I can do it without Fawsey and the gang finding out. Do you know a good supply depot or something like that, say, over on a Care or on the West Coast, big enough to be important and to start a second prospectors' rush away from us?" "How about one of those hospitals?" "No, not a hospital. We might use them to talk Wade Lucas into joining us. A lot of medical stores would be a good bait for him. I'm afraid he's going to make trouble if we don't do something about him." "Well, how about engineering and construction equipment? I know where there's a lot of that down to the southwest." "That's farming country. That stuff will be useful down there. I'll do that." The next morning, Rodney Maxwell scorched the stratosphere to store send in his recon car. The day after he got back, there was a big discovery of engineering equipment to the southwest, and as he had anticipated, a second rush of prospectors. They had the vertical shaft clear now, and the Lester Dawes was shuttling back and forth between Force Command Duplicate and Storrs End. Other ships were coming in now, mostly privately owned freighting ships. They bought almost anything as fast as it came out. The stock market had been paralyzed for a couple of days after the Discovery Force Command. Nobody seemed to know what to sell and what to hold. And now it was going perfectly insane. 20 or 30 new companies were being formed. Unlike Litchfield Exploration and Salvage, they were all offering their stock to the public. A week after the opening of Force Command, the stock exchange reported the first 500,000 share day since the war. A week after that, there were 2 million share days in succession. Some of the LE&S stockholders who had come out on the first day began drifting back to Litchfield. Lester Dawes was the first to defect. There was nothing he could do at Force Command, and a great deal that needed his personal attention at the bank. Morgan Gatworth and Lorenzo Menardis and one or two others followed. Kurt Fawsey, however, refused to leave. Merlin was somewhere here at Force Command. He was sure of it, and he wasn't leaving till it was found. Neither were Franz Veltrin, or Dolph Kelton, or Judge Ledoux. Tom Brangwyn resigned as town marshal. Clem Zaref was too busy even to think of Merlin. He had almost as many men under his command, and twice as much contragravity as he had had when the System States Alliance Army had surrendered. Conn flew to Litchfield and found that the Public Works project had come to a stop at noon of the day when Force Command was entered, and that nothing had been done on it since. The cold vitrifier was still standing in the middle of the mall, and topside Litchfield was littered in a dozen places with forsaken equipment and half-completed paving. There was no one in Kurt Fawsey's office in the airlines building, and the employment office was jammed with migratory workers vainly seeking jobs. He hunted up Morgan Gatworth, the lawyer. "Can't some of you get things started again?" he wanted to know. "This place is worse than it was before they started cleaning up." "Yes, I know." Gatworth walked to an open window and looked down on the littered mall. "But everybody just dropped everything as soon as you opened Force Command. Kurt Fawsey has not been here since." "Well, you're here. Lester Dawes and Lorenzo Menardis are here. Why don't you just take over? Kurt Fawsey couldn't care less what you do. He's forgotten he's mayor of Litchfield. He's forgotten there is a Litchfield. Well, I don't like to just move into the mayor's office and take over." From somewhere below, a submachine gun hammered. There were yells, pistol shots, and the submachine gun hammered again, a couple of short bursts. "Some of the farm tramps who can't get jobs, trying to steal something to eat, I suppose," Conn commented. Gatworth was frowning thoughtfully. He'd only need one more, very slight push. "Why don't you talk to Wade Lucas? He's got brains, and he's honest. Nobody but an honest man would have made himself as unpopular as Lucas has. If you pretend to be disillusioned with this Merlin business, it might help convince him. He was blaming you and your father for what's been going on here in the last 2 weeks. Yes, he'd help get things straightened out." At home, he found his mother simply dazed. She was happy to see him, and solicitous about his and his father's health. It seemed at times, though, as if he were somebody she had never met before. Events had gotten so far beyond her that she wasn't even trying to catch up. Flora, returning from school, stopped short when she saw him. "Well, I hope you like what you've done," she greeted him. "For a start, yes." "For a start? You know what you've done?" "Yes. I don't know what you think I've done, though. Tell me." "You've turned everything into a madhouse. You've sent this whole world Merlin crazy. Look at the stock market." "You look at it. All I can see is a pack of lunatics playing Russian roulette with 5 chambers loaded out of 6. Some of this so-called stock that's being peddled around isn't worth 5 millisols a share. Seekers for Merlin Limited closed today at 170. You notice there isn't any LE&S being traded. If you don't believe me, talk to Lester Dawes. He'll tell you what we think of this market." "Well, it's your fault." "In part, it's my fault that any of these quarter-wits have any money to play the market with. They wouldn't have money enough to play a 5-cent-a-sol slot machine if we hadn't gotten a little business started." There was just a little truth to that, too. A few woolen socks were coming out from under mattresses, and a few tin cans were being exhumed in cellars since the new flood of Federation equipment and supplies had gotten on the market. He'd seen a freshly lettered sign on Len Yanaguti's tailor shop, quarter price in Federation currency. That night, however, he had one of the nightmares he used to have as a child, a dream of climbing up onto a huge machine and getting it started, and then clinging, helpless and terrified, unable to stop it as it went faster and faster towards destruction. Clemzerf's patrols were encountering larger outlaw bands, the result of gang mergers. They were fighting with prospecting parties, and prospecting parties were fighting one another. Much of this was making the newscasts. One battle between two regularly chartered prospecting companies lasted 3 days, with an impressive casualty list. Public demands were growing that the planetary government do something about the situation. The government was wondering what to do, or how. There were indignant questions in Parliament. Finally, the government dragged a couple of armed ships off Mothball Row, a combat freighter like the Lester Dawes and a big assault transport, and began trying to get them into commission. And, of course, the market boom was still on. The newscasts were full of that, too. He had started worrying about if a bust came. Now he was worrying about what would happen when it did. Another good reason for wanting to get to Koshai and getting a hypership built. When the bust came, he and his father would want one very badly. In any case, it was time to begin getting an expedition ready for Barathrum Spaceport. Quite a few of the new companies had large contragravity craft, and the nascent planetary air navy was approaching a state of being. He wanted to get out of there before anybody else did. Maybe if they got the hypership built soon enough, it would start a second sound boom that would cushion the crash of the present speculative market when it came, as come it must. He talked to Clem Zareth about borrowing a couple of the 80-foot gunboats. Zareth's attitude was automatically negative. "We mustn't weaken our defense perimeter. We'd be inviting disaster. Why, this whole country in here is simply swarming with outlaws. They fired one of our gunboats, the Werewolf, yesterday." He'd heard about that. Somebody had launched a missile from the ground, and the Werewolf had detonated it with a counter-missile. It had probably been some legitimate prospecting company who'd taken the LENS craft for a pirate. "There was a battle down in the Devil's Pig Pen day before yesterday." That had been outlaws. They'd been annihilated by something calling itself Seekers for Merlin Limited, whose stock was still skyrocketing on the exchange. He mentioned that. "These other prospecting companies are doing a lot of our outlaw fighting for us, and as long as the country is full of small independent parties, the outlaws go after them and leave us alone." "Yes, I have my doubts about a lot of these prospecting companies, and a lot of the outlaws, too," Zareth said. "I think a lot of both are Federation agents. They're waiting till we find Merlin, and then they'll jump us." "Well," Conn adjusted his argument to the old rebel's obsession, "I'll admit that is a possibility. If so, we'll need heavier weapons than we have. This spaceport on Barathrum might be just the place to get them." "Yes, it might. Defense armament and storage ships weapons. Say if we grab that place and move all the heavy guns and missiles here, we could stand off anybody." The thought of a fight with minions of the Terran Federation seemed to have shaved 10 years off his age in a twinkling. "You take the Lester Dawes and, let's say, 3 of these gunboats. Let me see. Goblin, Fred Karski, and Vampire, Charlie Gadworth, and Dragon, Stefan Jorson. They're all good men, home guard, trained them myself." "Aren't you coming, Colonel?" "Oh, I'd like to, Conn, but I can't. I don't want to be away from here. No telling what might happen. But you keep in constant screen contact. If you get in any trouble, I'll come with everything I can put into the air." End of Chapter 8.